Hello everyone. My name is Margaret Irons and I am the librarian at the School of Celtic Studies Library at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. The Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies is a statutory body established in 1940 with a remit to further advanced study and to conduct research in specialised branches of knowledge. The School of Celtic Studies is one of the three constituent schools of the Institute. Other schools are the School of Theoretical Physics and the School of Cosmic Physics. The School of Celtic Studies is dedicated to the study of Irish and other Celtic languages, both written and spoken throughout their history, as well as related areas of cultural, social, and legal history. The school regularly publishes books and other online resources and issues the annual journal Celtica. The library at the School of Celtic Studies is a world-class research library and provides resources to the top professors, scholars, fellows, and visitors in the area of Celtic studies. In the library, we support the work of the school, and we aim to provide the best facilities and materials for the purpose of advanced research towards publication. So our collections include books, journals, maps, and microfilm, amongst other things. We have approximately 30,000 books. Books are selected by relevance and academic quality in manuscript studies, grammar, lexicography, philology of Old, Middle and Modern Irish, the phonetics of Irish dialects and living speech, paleography, textual criticism, etc., etc. We have approximately 300 current and non-current journal titles, but mostly current. Some titles have ceased publication. Most of our journals are in print and range in the same subject areas as our book collection, but we also have some journals which are now becoming increasingly online. However, they are mostly in print. We also have a collection of pamphlets and offprints, photostats of manuscripts, and a microfilm collection, which is of vital significance. The microfilm collection, there is no other collection like it in the country. It was assembled by Professor Padraig de Bruin in the mid-1980s. The purpose of the collection was to get every Irish manuscript in Ireland and abroad into one location for scholars. It covers a broad range of manuscripts, and the institutions who gave these microfilms were generous in granting unrestricted permission for academic use of the collection. Visitors are welcome from all over Ireland to consult this collection. The range of the collection has not yet been totally replaced by digitisation, so it is still of huge academic significance for access. We have approximately 800 items in this collection. Some of our rare collections include manuscripts, facsimiles, special collections, and one item which I'm going to speak about, which is a favourite of mine, and that is Materia Medica. We have 4 manuscripts in the library which are digitised on ISOS. It would not be the remit of the School of Celtic Studies Library to collect manuscripts, so these manuscripts over the years were kindly donated in collections. There are 4 of them, as I mentioned, and they are digitised on ISOS, which you will hear about in another talk. They are called the O'Farrell manuscript, the O'Cahan manuscript, and Dunnington manuscripts 1 and 2. We also have a collection of approximately 40 facsimiles. A facsimile is a reproduction or a copy of a book or a manuscript, and included in our collection, as you can see there, would be Lara Brack and the Book of Leinster. You will also hear more about these facsimiles or what facsimiles are in another talk. Whilst offering a copied alternative, a facsimile is very good at helping you accessing a copy as opposed to the original of a manuscript, but they are often still illegible and sometimes difficult to access. So once again, it is of great benefit to the researcher that many of these items are also now digitised on ISOS. Items in our special collection then are any items that are pre-1900, of exceptional value to the subject, or are rare and difficult to replace. And these items are in closed cabinets and can only be accessed by request to library staff. So as I mentioned, Materia Medica would be one of my favourites. We have been very kindly donated interesting collections over the years, which also sometimes includes items of rare and specialised interest. One item of interest would be a translation into English of Tadhg O'Coon's Materia Medica by Micheál Ó Cruthaoir. And it was part of a collection that was donated to the school in the early 90s. The historical significance of O'Coon's medical text and Micheál's translation of it after extensive research has been well commented on by scholars in the area. The Materia Medica testifies not only to the close relations that existed between the learned classes of Gaelic Ireland and medieval Europe, but also to the sophistication of the pharmacology and medical training in 15th century Gaelic society. This text of ours, we do not have the manuscript, this text that was donated to the school is now kindly, through collaboration with other institutions, digitised on Celt, which is the corpus of electronic texts, which is available through the website of UCC. So if you look for Celt in UCC. Some of our projects and databases at the school include ISOS, Irish Script on Screen, BIL, the Bibliography of Irish Linguistics and Literature, GLORE, the Gaelic Language Online Recordings, OM in 3D, which is self-explanatory, I hope, the Bardi Poetry Database, and Monasticon Hibernicum. Irish Script on Screen, or ISOS, is a mass digitisation project of the school with over 425 manuscripts now on the site. You will learn more about this at another talk. So Irish Script on Screen has been, we like to think, liberating manuscripts since 1999. The Bibliography of Irish Linguistics and Literature, or BIL, lists thousands of publications relevant to Celtic studies. This online bibliography is a specialist reference tool for scholars and students of Irish language and literature. It comprises references to scholarly works published since 1972, and BIL is an ongoing project and is being regularly maintained and updated. It is the remit of the library to have access to these references readily available in the library. Therefore, we work closely with the bibliographer to identify acquisition recommendations for the library. GLORE, the Gaelic Language Online Recordings, is a project of the school also, which aims to make available recordings of Irish speakers in various parts of counties Clare, Cork, Donegal, Kerry, Galway, Louth, Mayo and Waterford, which were collected by members of staff in the school during the 1950s. The archive comprises approximately 100 hours of recordings, with the bulk of the material coming from Cork and Galway. The recordings were mostly made by members of the school staff in connection with their various linguistic and dialect studies. Among collectors were Brian O'Queeve, Heinrich Wagner, and Richard B. Brannock. OM in 3D produces three-dimensional models of Ogham stones on which Ireland's earliest form of writing is preserved. The project focuses exclusively on bringing all of the available information together in a single searchable resource and adding a crucial new dimension to the work already carried out in the form of 3D models of the stones. We also host the Bardi Poetry Database, which is the work of Dr. Catherine Sims from Trinity College Dublin, and is currently being updated and expanded by Dr. Micheál Hoyne at the School of Celtic Studies. This database is a vital resource for students of medieval and early modern Ireland. And we also host Monasticon Hibernicum, which is a database of early Christian ecclesiastical settlements in Ireland, produced by previous members of staff. The publications remit of the school is one of the most important functions. We are a leading publisher in the field. Works are submitted both by academic staff of the School of Celtic Studies and scholars, and are subject to rigorous peer review. Books can be purchased in our online shop, and access to all of these sites that I mentioned are available through our main website. Publications are made in bibliography, manuscript studies, Celtic grammar, Irish language, Irish literature, Welsh, Breton, Hiberno Latin. Celtica is the annual journal of the school. It's a peer-reviewed journal, and since its first appearance in 1946, it has published pioneering work in all aspects of Celtic studies, including, of course, linguistics, literature, manuscript studies, textual criticism, history, law, dialect studies, and onomastics. It covers all of the Celtic languages and all periods from the earliest inscriptions to the spoken language of the present day. So to gain access to our catalogue, the online library catalogue contains records of all of the items in the library, and it can be accessed via library.celt.dias.ie. When I started working in the library, there was still a considerable amount of records still on a card catalogue. Not only did this make items more difficult to find, but it also made it more difficult to borrow and to keep secure. Thankfully, due to many helpful projects over the years, we now have the majority of our records on the online catalogue. This also makes the collection more secure and accessible for the researcher. DAR is the name of our institutional repository. The library is responsible for this. And as repository manager, I am delighted to be providing a platform that highlights open access to research. One of the guiding principles of the Institute is to stimulate the dissemination of knowledge and to make that knowledge accessible and reusable. DAR provides the necessary infrastructure to encourage open access to our research and is expanding and developing all the time. We are also a member of a cooperative called ALCID, which is Academic Libraries Cooperating in Dublin and Ireland. So as we are not a lending library, if you are a member of ALCID through your own institution, you can contact us about access. So engagement and outreach. The school runs an annual conference called the Chinole, regular seminars, talks, and we also host a podcast. The annual Chinole is very well attended and attracts participants from many institutions, both nationally and internationally, and is held in November each year. Further conferences and seminars are also organised throughout the year, so keep an eye on our social media channels, our website, and even sign up to our mailing list to find out more about these events. Ní Hansa is the Old Irish for not difficult, which is precisely what you will think after listening to our podcast. In this podcast, Dr. Nika Stamm interviews scholars from the school and beyond about their research path and how they got into academia and their work to date and where it is going in the future. As a librarian, this is my desk, my lovely office. As a librarian, it is a very rewarding and fulfilling job to be running, as we see it, the engine room of the school. I have been a librarian for over 2 decades now and have spent the majority of that time at DIAS, where I ensure that the library predicts necessary trends in library service provision and provides an evolving facility to the dedicated specialised users on a national and an international level. Maintaining and developing the collection both in print and online is, of course, one of my favourite parts of the role, but I also enjoy the very basic and fundamental moment when you help a researcher find exactly what they're looking for. I support all research staff towards their research and publication work. To provide this service to researchers at all stages of their careers and from all corners of the globe in a collegial and respectful manner is both a fundamental principle of librarianship and of the Institute. I am honoured to meet and work with colleagues and scholars who value research and publication to such an extent that we can learn from each other on a daily basis. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can contact me at the details on the screen. Thank you.
So there you heard from our librarian, Margaret Arns, about how the school's library works. I can vouch for the Ní Hansa podcast. It's extremely entertaining. And that's not just because it features myself, but it also features Micheál Hoyne and Chantal Coble, who you'll hear from today. So next we're going to move on to Anne-Marie O'Brien from ISOS, Irish Script on Screen. And if you just bear with me 1 second now, hoping that my technology does not fail me. 1 moment, please. Okay. Here we go. Now, please enjoy.
My name's Anne-Marie O'Brien, and I'm the current director of Irish Script on Screen project here at the School of Celtic Studies. Irish Script on Screen, or ISOS as it's commonly named, is a mastersization project of Irish manuscripts. With the arrival of digitisation in the 1990s, the School of Celtic Studies sought to connect its published research to the high-quality digital images of the manuscript themselves. So in 1999, a project called ISOS was set up to make this a reality. We're currently celebrating our 21st year this year. Irish Script on Screen was one of the first specialist manuscript digitisation projects established in Ireland, and to date, it's one of the longest running in Europe. It's been an exploration of new technologies and cutting-edge techniques, with brave steps by institutions to come on their very first digital journeys with us. With the coming of the digital revolution, the way in which people accessed information changed considerably. In the late 1980s, less than 1% of the world's technologically stored information was in digital format, while it was 94% in 2007 and more than 99% by 2014. Digitisation was a new concept, and it was taken with an air of skepticism. The first hurdles were the limits that IT presented. The storage and internet connections needed was so great that when ISOS was first established, it was run as a joint project between the School of Celtic Studies and the School of Computer Applications in DCU. This collaboration continued until in and around 2004, when the IT facilities were becoming more established at the School of Celtic Studies. We're able to host the site in the Dublin Institute ourselves. But when we first started out back in 1999, floppy disks were still around. We were using Amiga Jazz drives to store and transport data. They stored about 1 gigabyte in a chunky removable cartridge, and you needed a special drive with SCSI adapter at each PC. To give you context, the size of a current digitized manuscript would have needed 775 floppy disks or 186 Amiga Jazz drives just to store it back in 2000. After this, we moved on to Dlt Tapes. They were the next biggest thing in archival backups, storing 10 gigabytes, each tape costing €80, with the promise of lasting 30 years. A little under 5 years in, I decided to test that theory. To my shock, about 20% had become unreadable. I was glad we'd made 2 copies. In 2003, with funding from the Irish Heritage Council, we managed to purchase 2 servers that cost $20,000 for 2 terabytes of data. Each were the size of a fridge. The same hard drive of 2 terabytes is now portable. It can fit it in my bag and costs €65. Technology has dramatically changed in the last 21 years, and ISOS had to be able to adapt and change as emerging new developments and technologies were established. Currently, our archives run to over 21 terabytes. Today, Gaelic manuscripts are to be found throughout the world in libraries and in private collections. For the most part, they have found their way to large institutions throughout Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. There's roughly 5,000 survived manuscripts that we currently know of. They range in date from the 11th to the 19th century. The earliest manuscripts are made from vellum, but this changes by the middle of the 16th century when paper starts to take over. A vellum manuscript was made from a prepared animal skin, typically calf skin, which was bleached, stretched, and scraped until smooth. And it was then tensioned on a wooden frame and left to dry. It was a very durable material and a precious commodity. The production of vellum required quite a considerable investment. The animal would have to be killed before its potential for meat or dairy was realized. Only the wealthiest monasteries could therefore afford vellum. And this material can pose quite distinct challenges when digitizing. As vellum is a skin, it's a porous material. Even the slightest temperature and humidity changes by a person in the room will have effects on a vellum manuscript. This material can start to move when it's taken out of the controlled environment where it is stored, and this can cause issues when digitizing. We like flat surfaces when digitizing, and vellum, well, it will start to move and buckle when it begins to dry out or even heat up by a few degrees of temperature. Remember, it's a skin that's been stretched thin. Before digitization, each manuscript will have to be assessed to gauge what precautions might be necessary, whether it would stand being opened out to a certain degree, and how fragile has it become over time. Would you believe the earliest manuscripts that were written on vellum are mostly found in a better condition than their later paper manuscripts? Here you can see the setup we use to digitize the manuscripts. We use a non-intrusive capture mechanism called a Grazer conservated graded book cradle. Sensitivity to the fragile nature of the manuscripts is paramount to the project. Our hope is to give them back exactly as they came to us. Prior to digitization, a manuscript is examined and assessed in order to determine what precautions might be necessary during image capture. After the manuscript is assessed, the cradle is used to fully support the manuscript at all times so that no undue stress is placed on the spine when it's been opened out. A large format 5:4 Signer camera with phase 1 IQ 180 digital back is used to capture the images. It's a case of old meets new, the most cutting edge digital back meeting one of the earliest camera styles. You can see the camera there on the top. You might be familiar with this type of photographic image depicting an old camera setup. Large format cameras were one of the earliest photographic devices, and the reason we use a large format camera on the ISIS project is based on the need to have access to a system that allows a mobility of focus. As you've already heard, the earliest manuscripts were written on vellum or calf skin, a substance that can produce a contoured surface. With the 5:4 camera, we gain full control on manipulating and focusing on the four corners of the parchment. To keep heat to a minimum, we use a North-like copy system with cold lights so they produce very little heat, and temperature and humidity are always constantly monitored and maintained. After capture, the image is loaded through a Capture One Pro, a raw converter and imaging editing software. The image will have to then meet ever-increasing digital imaging standards, the like set out by the Bardi, Metamorphosis and ISO standards. These can bring you to a limit where you almost need to be a colour scientist, with targets to measure tone, colour, noise, etc. When digitization of a complete manuscript is finished, we then move on to the processing stage. This is where metadata is generated for the manuscript, allows us to incorporate it as a new digital asset into our digital repository. One of the key factors in the success of ISOS.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to try figure out this sound because I don't want you to miss out. You've probably missed out on enough of this without me making it any worse. So I was wondering, Anne-Marie, is there any chance you would be able to share this video on your laptop with better sound quality?
I can, and I will actually try to give it now. Sorry, I was delayed joining.
Okay.
My voice is a little bit gone, but maybe you might be able to make me out a little bit better. Yeah. I still share it from the
You should be a host now, Anne-Marie. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Can you see my slideshow there?
I can indeed.
Okay, I'll take it from slide 6.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Okay. No, perfect. Right. Okay, I'll take it from here. Here you can see the setup we use to digitize the manuscripts. And this is called a non-intrusive capture mechanism called the Grazer Conservative Gradle Book Cradle. So sensitivity to the fragile nature of the manuscript is paramount to the project. Our hope is to give the manuscript back exactly as it came to us. So prior to digitization, manuscript is examined and assessed in order to determine what precautions might be necessary during image capture. After the manuscript is assessed, the cradle is used to fully support the manuscript at all times so that no undue stress is placed on the spine when it's opened out. A large format 5:4 Signer camera with phase 1 IQ 180 digital back is used to capture the images. It's kind of a case of old meets new with the most cutting edge digital back, meeting one of the earliest camera styles. So you might be familiar with this type of photographic image depicting an old camera setup. Large format cameras were some of the earliest photographic devices. And the reason we use the large format camera on the ISOS projects is based on the need to have access to a system that allows a mobility of focus. As we've already heard, the earliest Irish manuscripts were written on vellum or calf skin, a substance that can produce a contoured surface. With the 5:4 camera, we can gain full control on manipulating and focusing on the four corners of the parchment. To keep heat to a minimum, we use a North-like copy system with cold lights. So they produce very little heat, and temperature and humidity are always constantly monitored and maintained. After capture, the image is loaded through a Capture One Pro, a raw converter and imaging editing software. The image will then have to meet ever-increasing digital imaging standards, the likes set out by the FAGI, Metamorphosis, and the ISO standards, and they can bring you to a limit that you need to be almost a colour scientist, with targets to measure tone, colour, noise, etc. When digitisation of the complete manuscript is finished, we then move on to the processing stage, and this is where metadata is generated for the manuscript and allows us to incorporate it then as a new digital asset into our repository. One of the key factors in the success of ISOS is the high quality attained in the image capture itself. Images are digitized at a resolution of at least 600 dpi, with each pixel being 24-bit color. The file size of any given image varies according to the physical size of the manuscript page, but in general, an uncompressed digital image, so a TIFF image, of a manuscript page may result in files in excess of 2 gigabytes. So that's quite big by the time you get to the end of the manuscript. In the past, the use of surrogates such as facsimiles, photostats, and microfilm copies were made. These were not considered even half adequate to the original manuscript itself. And here you can see an example of a digitized image we have up in ISOS, the Yellow Book of Leinster from Trinity College. It's the first time it was digitally reproduced. On the left is a sample page, what was up until then the only available copy, a facsimile. As you can see, it's muddied and illegible in sections. On the right is the low resolution image that is now available to all users on the ISO site, in which you can kind of clearly now see all areas. This has opened up a whole new path for research material. Here's just a small sample of how clear the detail is in a high resolution image, which is available to the register user on the ISOS site. So here at the School of Celtic Studies, we're lucky to have in our possession 4 manuscripts, which have been very kindly donated over the years to the school. So on the left, you have the O'Farrell manuscript, which came to the school on the bequest of the late Father Patrick Inasis MacLachlan. It's a 19th century paper manuscript written by a teacher called Seamus O'Farrell, which is an interesting account of Ogham writings and abbreviations used by Irish scribes. In the center, you have the O'Cahan manuscript, which was donated to the School of Celtic Studies in 1982 by Sheila Nick Faulkner. It is a volume of stories, lays, songs, and poems written by Pernicius O'Cahan from Killikee, County Kildare in 1844, while he was living in Dublin, where he worked as a law clerk. It's a great example of how the scribal tradition was still continuing in Ireland into the 19th century, which is quite rare at this point throughout Europe and just demonstrates our very rich scribal traditions. On the right is the most recent donation to the library, the Dunnington manuscripts, which have an interesting story of how they were on the cusp of being lost to history. There are 2 manuscripts originally from Waterford, both 19th century, containing songs, poetries, and stories. These manuscripts, named Dunnington MS 1 and 2, were so called after their saviour, a Mr. Dunnington, and were generously donated to the School of Celtic Studies by the late Professor Dlt Tapes from the University of Cincinnati. And they have a fascinating tale of being rescued by a Mr. Dunnington while in Louisville, Kentucky. Mr. Dunnington is a collector of Civil War books and memorabilia. While in Louisville, he heard the sale of the Library of the Holy Cross Fathers Seminary. While attending the event, he recognized the Irish manuscripts, even though they were listed for sale by auctioneers as in Greek or Latin. Out of curiosity and ethnic pride, he purchased them. Being of Irish ancestry, he recognized the 2 manuscripts were written in Gaelic, since he'd been to Ireland and knew the characteristic form of the script. But he did not know Irish and sought out Professor Dlt Tapes' help in figuring out the treasure which he had fallen upon. There's now another great addition to the ISO site, and of which you can view the images and read Professor Stolpen's account and extensive catalogues of the Dunnington manuscripts online free of charge on the ISO site. So ISOS continues to be a very successful project. Its growth has been greatly facilitated by the development of institutional partnership agreements with all the major repositories of Irish manuscripts in Ireland, including the likes of the National Library of Ireland, the Royal Irish Academy, Trinity College Dublin, to name a few, but also has developed internationally with the likes of the National Library of Scotland, the State Library of Victoria, KBR, the Royal Library of Belgium, and the British Library coming on board. Collaborations to date reach some 28 different institutions here and abroad. There are now over 425 manuscripts on ISOS, upwards of 80,000 large resolution images. All images are free of charge. Standard images are on open access, and by filling out a registration form, one gains full access, again free of charge, to the specialist high quality images. Through ISOS, Irish manuscripts have been given a new platform of discovery, not only for academic research purposes, but also to the wider public in general. Images from ISOS have been used for exhibitions displayed in heritage and visitor centres for people simply searching their ancestry through genealogies. Artists use images for inspiration and design, and we supply images for film, documentaries, and even last year there was an image of a bagpipe playing pig from the Royal Academy's MSD tutu was used from Ireland's national postage system on a commemorative stamp. And although the project has been running for quite a substantial amount of time, there's still a lot of work to do. Resources and funding are always being sought to further increase the digitization of Gaelic manuscripts. ISOS provides a powerful tool to progress the study of Irish paleography, to further manuscript studies and open the exploration of Celtic culture to many future generations to come. So please come along and take a look at the many treasures that lie within. All the images are free of charge, and we welcome you to have a look around. Thank you for listening.
That was fabulous, Anne-Marie. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for taking over it live in person in the middle. It's all go here. And my apologies again for any sound issues that came up. But you can, of course, ask Anne-Marie to fill in any blanks in the Q&A session. I'm sure you'll have loads of questions. I suppose the most important thing for everybody to know and to remember is that ISOS is free, and anybody can go onto the site and look at these wonderful manuscripts. It's, as Margaret said, liberation of Irish manuscripts, this digitisation project. So that was fantastic. Okay, so Anne-Marie, would you do me a favour and pass the power of hosting over to Chantal? So you go to Chantal's little face box, or her little image there.
Oh, there you go. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And if you could click the blue box and then make her a host.
Gosh, we're still figuring it all out. Perfect.
I know.
I think I've done that. You think you know better.
Okay, so next up we have Chantal Coble, one of our Bergen Fellows, one of two. So welcome, Chantal.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, I have to admit people as well, like, while we're doing this, or anyway.
Just ignore that, Chantal, they're too late.
Okay, thank you. So in this short talk, I'm going to focus on printed facsimiles of manuscripts. To begin with, I explain what a facsimile is and what methods were used to print a facsimile. Then I give a brief glimpse into a handful of original format facsimiles of medieval Irish manuscripts held in the library, touching upon what the advantages and limitations are of these valuable sources. Sorry, you're done. Yeah, okay. So the word facsimile derives from the Latin term facsimile, meaning make similar or make alike. A facsimile is the faithful reproduction, that is, an exact copy as true to the original source as possible of a manuscript, a map, or printed book. This means a facsimile can display all visible characteristics of the original work. Depending on the type of reproduction, this can include the vibrant colours of a manuscript, as well as the physical features such as defects and irregularities. We've already heard from Anne-Marie about digital facsimiles or surrogates of manuscripts, but the precursor to these were printed facsimiles. There were several methods used that came about as printing techniques developed in the mid-19th century. One method that was used was lithography, a term which derives from Greek lithos, meaning stone, and graphin, meaning to write. It is a printing technique which is used to create or reproduce multiple copies of a text, and it is executed in ink or pencil directly on limestone. Alternatively, a text was transcribed by hand onto transfer paper, which was then transferred to stone, from which it could be printed, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. Developed in the 19th century, photosyncography was a process whereby photographic negatives were printed onto zinc plates and then printed off similarly to lithography on stone. In the 1860s, another photographic method was devised known as colotype. The name colotype is derived from the Greek word kola, meaning glue. Colotype designates printing of a photographic negative from a gelatin surface, typically done on a glass plate in a lithographic manner. So with the development of photography, the possibility of making facsimiles in the modern sense was born. Handmade copies no longer would suffice to reproduce a page of a manuscript, but rather the direct application of a photographic image became the basis of the work of a printer. So the School of Celtic Studies library houses a fantastic selection, as we've heard from Margaret, of printed facsimiles of medieval Irish and Welsh manuscripts, which can be found using the online catalogue. These facsimiles are rare printed editions, of which only several hundred were printed. These facsimiles provide students and scholars at every level an invaluable opportunity to study texts and books that they otherwise might never be granted access to see, let alone handle. Among the most important of the collection of facsimiles in the library are those of manuscripts which were transcribed by a man called Joseph O'Longoin. In 1865, O'Longoin was appointed to replace Eugene O'Curry, a scribe employed by the Royal Irish Academy. O'Longoin used the transcript transfer method, and between 3 facsimiles that he worked on, he copied over 1,000 pages in a period of 15 years. These facsimiles by him are stunning and monumental works, which not only display his wonderful penmanship, but also match the originals they mirror to such an extent that even minute flaws are matched folio by folio and line by line. So in 1871, the first facsimile of medieval Irish manuscript was published, namely Lever na Hidre, or the Book of the Dun Cow, an important 12th century Irish language manuscript, and only 200 copies of this facsimile were printed. One of the advantages of using a facsimile is the clarity and legibility of the work, where sometimes, contrary to Anne-Marie's example, sometimes the manuscript is illegible due to staining caused by a chemical reagent. Such an example, as is seen here on this slide in the Lever na Hidre copy of the Táin Bó Cúailnge, we can see staining on the right-hand side of the page where the text is illegible, but in comparison to that of the facsimile where it is legible. A particular disadvantage of facsimiles produced by the transcript transfer method is that scribal hands or styles are often not distinguished, which represents a drawback for any paleographical study. In the facsimile of Lever na Hidre, for instance, Joseph was not too concerned with replicating changes of hand or style, as can be seen in this slide, of a few lines of page 37 of the manuscript. So if you look closely between the two, you can spot a difference in the style of the two-shaped or the US compendium and the R compendium in comparison to that by Joseph O'Longoin. But by the time he completed the Book of Leinster facsimile 9 years later, or the transcription of it rather, he would not just be carefully imitating variations in Gaelic script, he would be demonstrating his mastery of the Anglo-Norman hands in that manuscript also. For instance, he perfectly captures the signatures of a later user who repeatedly writes his name in the upper margin of page 9. But no better example of this, of O'Longoin's care in distinguishing styles of script, is seen than on the opening page of the Book of Leinster copy of the Táin Bó Cúailnge, where O'Longoin differentiates between the 15th century Anglo-Norman hand, which copies a bardic poem on a razor in the left column, and here on the right-hand column, you have the opening section of the Táin in Irish minuscule. O'Longoin also transcribed the Leabhar Brack, or the Speckled Book, an important early 15th century book containing predominantly religious material. This transcription was used for the Facsimile, which was published in 1876, and the size, line spacing, abbreviations and contractions, and physical characteristics were faithfully reproduced. So you can see here on page 74, a hole in the vellum, which he reproduces in the facsimile, and carefully writing the text around the hole just as it is in the original. Now, discolored vellum and fading ink can be challenging for the modern reader, even with the availability of digitized images, where one can zoom in closely in an attempt to read length marks or even tiny script of interlinear glossing. But the clarity and legibility of the facsimile, especially since it is printed on white paper, is advantageous to the ease of reading and to see the presence of length marks, for example, here. Of course, there are disadvantages with the lithographic facsimiles copied by O'Longoin, the most notable being errors of transcription. He was human after all. However, included in his facsimiles are corrigenda, such as in the Leabhar Brack facsimile, which includes a list of corrigenda of 480 items. So it's always important to check the readings in the main text of the facsimile against the corrigenda. And lastly, another important facsimile in the library is that of the hugely important 14th century manuscript, the Book of Moat, a collection of prose and verse in the Irish language. This facsimile was begun using the lithographic transcription transfer method by O'Longoin, but sadly he died in 1880 while working on the transcript. Every detail of the text, including the decorated capitals as you see on this page, was faithfully replicated by him. He even copied the drawing of a ship with a king and his family on board that now serves as the frontispiece of the manuscript. So work on a facsimile of the Book of Moat was consequently suspended because no scribe with comparable skill could be found to replace him. The work was eventually published 7 years later as a photographic facsimile. The editor, Robert Atkinson, was unhappy with the quality of the photographic reproduction, considering it, and I quote, more fatiguing to read than the unblurred pages of a faithful transcript by an accomplished scribe. So to conclude, before the advent of digitized manuscripts, printed facsimiles facilitated the research of medieval Irish texts and manuscripts, which may otherwise have been difficult to access at the time. We are extremely fortunate to have such a wide range of these facsimiles available in the library. Printed facsimiles are still important and relevant sources today for the study of these manuscripts and their texts. They, along with digital surrogates, also aid the conservation of the original manuscripts, and students and scholars should use these as a tool to read the texts and understand the size and scale of a manuscript without, or at least before, accessing the original. Thank you. And there is an article.
Fantastic, thank you, Chantal. That was excellent, excellent stuff. And now we're going to pass the mic over to Micheál Hoyne. If you're there, Micheál.
I am, yes.
You are. Okay. And do you have a presentation as well? Have you got the power to share your screen?
I do. 1 sec. I'll get that up.
Excellent.
I hope everybody can see that.
Yes.
Great. So I have 2 jobs to do now before we wrap up. The first one is to give you a taster of some of the early printed books held by the Library of the School of Celtic Studies. We don't have a vast collection of early printed material, but some of what we do have is very important. Some of it is quite rare, and particular copies that we have interesting stories that deserve to be recorded in their own right. My second job then will be to show you some images from Irish Leabhar Stad. These are 4 volumes that were donated to the school by Professor Fergus Kelly and his wife Elizabeth when Professor Kelly retired in 2014. They span the years 1900 to 1905. And they are a sort of guest book and journal kept by an Irish language social club on North Frederick Street that, as we'll see, contain much of historical and cultural interest. So first off, a few of the early printed books that we hold that are old or rare. I picked 3 samples more or less at random because they're interesting to me. We have a lovely copy of an Irish language translation of the Book of Common Prayer from 1712. This was printed in London by the famous printer Eleanor Everingham, who was the widow of Robert Everingham. And among Robert Everingham's services for the Irish language, he printed the first complete Bible in the Irish language. And indeed, the Old Testament was first printed by him in 1685. The New Testament had been published as far back as 1602, and there was a very long delay in getting the Old Testament out. But eventually, Robert Everingham was able to perform the job. It's an interesting use of the Moxon type. Part of the fascination of printed material in Irish is the choice of type. Since the 1570s, there had been special types for the Irish language, but also the Irish language could, of course, as it is today, be printed in Roman. And indeed, we have examples of Irish being printed in black letter as well. You'll actually see here you have a bilingual text in the prayer book, English on one side, Irish on the other. That's the quite attractive Moxon type. Here you can see at the very top of the page, you have black letter for the heading, and then you have the Irish language script for the actual text itself. This particular work was carried out by a man called John Richardson, who was the rector of Belturbet in County Cavan. And he was very keen that the Church of Ireland should do more in the Irish language. He himself didn't necessarily have the best command of the language. He had Irish language assistants like Charles Linnegar, but he was quite a famous figure for his agitation on behalf of the Irish language within the Church of Ireland. He's mentioned a few times by Jonathan Swift in his diary. And initially, Jonathan Swift was quite positive about this rather earnest rector from Cavan, but after a short period he talks about being plagued by Mr. Richardson and his plan for printing stuff in Irish. One of the great achievements of Richardson's work in the Irish language is what you're looking at on the screen now, the elements of the Irish language. This is almost a genre for a lot of early printed Irish books, little guides that accompanied printed works, helping you to learn how to read Irish if you weren't familiar with it already. Sometimes these would be targeted at Irish speakers who maybe could read English but didn't yet have experience of reading Irish. Sometimes they're directed at a very, very broad audience, people who might only be learning Irish themselves. But Richardson's is a lovely, very, very brief guide to the big problem areas, if you like, of Irish spelling if you're coming at it as a novice. And it was extremely popular. It was copied later by other writers, including later writers of Catholic catechisms who were rather reluctant to admit that they were plagiarizing a Protestant authority. Another interesting book we have in the Institute Library is the Ordnance Survey of the County of Londonderry, or Derry, or London, if you're whatever your preference is. You'll see this is signed by previous owner John Gwynn, 1864. This is probably the John Gwynn who was Regius Professor of Divinity in Trinity College, one of a distinguished family of scholars who indeed produced major Irish language scholars as well, and were so prominent in Trinity for a long time that Trinity was sometimes called Gwynity because there were so many members of the Gwynn family in high office there. This was first published in 1835, an advanced edition for the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And then this edition came out in 1837 for the general public. And it was significant for using the new Petrie type of Irish print, which became the font, which became particularly popular. As a book, it's a mine of literary and antiquarian lore. It has fantastic illustrations. Here you see a plate showing some fossils. Here, some of the local architecture. Much of the research and writing was done by the famous Irish scholars George Petrie and John O'Donovan. It includes extensive extracts from Irish language sources, including the Annals of the Four Masters, which hadn't been printed yet, as well as other texts, isolated Irish words and bit of analysis, some philology, etymology, and so on. Now, only one volume of Ordnance Survey material ever appeared like this, and this is called Volume 1 for the County of Londonderry. It actually only covers one parish, the parish of Templemore, and no subsequent volumes ever appeared. And in fact, the volume was quite controversial and even was the subject of a parliamentary inquiry leading to a report in 1844, mostly because it was alleged that an inordinate sum of public money was being wasted. The whole work cost about more than £1,700, which really was a significant sum of money for printing a book. And 1,500 copies eventually went into print, but they only made about a little less than £500 back. So you've spent more than 1,700, you only make 500 back. It was a huge loss for the exchequer, and eventually the scheme was discontinued. But it was a popular book and often praised as one of the great books in Irish or about Irish. A third lovely printed book and a particularly important copy held in the School of Celtic Studies library is this Cassandra Gaelic, an introduction to the Irish language. Then as now, textbooks of the Irish language made up a significant chunk of what was printed in and about the Irish language. We do have Teach Yourself Irish textbooks from the 19th century. This was carried out, as you can see on the cover, it's signed just S.O. United M. And indeed, in the book, the author doesn't actually identify himself. His pen name is Saoirse Ó Bhacada. And the Institute copy is very important for confirming that the author is in fact George Field, because he helpfully signs his name here. He was based in Belfast and was involved in teaching the Irish language and seeking to revive it. It features some absolutely charming pictures to illustrate the alphabet. There you have A, Ossel, B, Ban, C, Clorshach, and so on. They were made using the lithographic method that Chantal described earlier. And they'd previously been used by the Ladies' Gaelic Society. Couldn't have men and women mixing in Gaelic society. So the Ladies' Gaelic Society, for a small primer they put out in Belfast in 1830. It has a lot that we wouldn't think of as being appropriate maybe in a grammar for beginners, like guides to Ogham and manuscript contractions and that sort of thing. But they were very, very common in grammars of this period, regarded as something you had to be familiar with if you were learning to read Irish. It's a very well-worn grammar. Somebody really got some use out of it. As you can see here, the pencil along the side, X's beside important notes and so on. There's this note then on the flyleaf. The late Mr. McCarthy informed me that this grammar, in a great measure, enabled him to obtain an Irish sizarship in Trinity College. Sizarship is a scholarship for people of limited means. It was at first given by me to J. Payne, a student in TCD, and passed from him into McCarthy's hands, and then back again to me from McCarthy. And that's signed JF, that is George Field, the author of the textbook. So he gave it to the student gave it to somebody else, and he had the gratification of knowing that, at least according to one of them, it was helpful in getting a scholarship to Trinity College. It's a lovely little human anecdote. And as I say, that's only preserved in the Institute copy, which therefore has a particular significance. So the second topic that I would like to discuss today, that is the Unstad guest books. These have already been treated in a lovely little book by Sean O'Carna, which is still available if you want to find out more. Unstad was an interesting expression of the Irish language revival at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. Anstad, or the stopping place, was based in North Frederick Street. It was run by Cathal McGarvey, a famous and interesting figure. Among his many achievements, he wrote the words to the song Star of the County Down. And in his tobacco shop, he sort of founded a kind of a social club, a hub for Gaelic leaguers, for people involved in the Gaelic League Conradh na Gaeilge, which had been founded in 1893. And in particularly, they were associated with the notorious Keating branch of the Conradh. There were mostly speakers of Munster Irish who would come into this club, but other dialects too. And the guest books contain a little bit of Scottish Gaelic, a little bit of Welsh, a little bit of French. The one language that was not to be written in the book was English. So at Anstad, many interesting people, actors, scholars, writers, politicians would come in. It was a centre for traditional music. It had a walking club. It had a hurling team. It was frequented by Nodriha, or the Druids, who were a sort of Irish language comedy group based in Trinity College. And they had their own journal on Toropach, as it was called, the European, designed to encourage the use of European languages, by which they meant, by the way, languages like French, German, Irish, but not English. So any European language except English, and especially Irish, they were trying to encourage. So it was a fairly lively and, I think, interesting place, many rambunctious people. And as they would come in, they would sign their names in this guest book, but it very swiftly becomes much more. They have little bits of poetry, jokes, drawings. We know the name of the waitress in Anstad. Her name was Lottie, and she seems to really have had a tough time with the men who were coming into this place. Much of the book is devoted to how attractive she is and to their attempts to flirt with her. I don't know if Lottie's views are recorded anywhere of what it was like. Several famous figures are signed their names. You can see here in a box that somebody has helpfully drawn around Eamon T. Count, that is Eamon Cant, who was executed in 1916, one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising. You won't find, of course, Pádraig Pearse in a book like this, because he was rather puritanical. I don't think he would have approved of all the drinking and carousing. And as well as that, he had his difficulties with the Keating branch of the Gaelic League. Michael Cusack signed his name and was a regular in Anstad. And it was actually in Anstad that James Joyce met Michael Cusack. And of course, Michael Cusack then appears in Anstad in Ulysses. He appears as the citizen in Ulysses. Michael Cusack, of course, founder of the GAA. For us in the Institute, there's a special interest because our first director, Osborne Bergen, frequented Anstad, and under his pen name, Craw Cree Agus, he wrote in this particular bit of verse in 1901. Craw Cree Agus, the heart's torment of learned men, was his sort of pen name. It was very popular in the early days of the revival to adopt these sort of Irish language pseudonyms. And indeed, if any of you ever read Miles Nagopoline's Beal Bocht, you'll know he ruthlessly satirizes that particular habit. But this little poem, anyway, that Osborne Bergen includes in the book contains an account of all the flirting that's going on in this house. And he actually uses the word flirtorocht for flirting. Now, Osborne Bergen has the reputation of being a very severe scholar, so to find him using words like flirtorocht is a little bit surprising, but he was human like the rest of us. Here we have a note by Seamus O'Cassige, a very famous Irish language scholar and publisher. And he refers to going to a meeting probably in the UCD branch of Conradh na Gaeilge with Kuno Meyer. He spells it there, C-U for the N-O, M-A for the O-R. And that's the very famous German scholar Kuno Meyer, who founded the School of Irish Learning and helped introduce the most up-to-date, rigorous philological methods to Ireland and to the study of Irish, and is sort of the spiritual founder of the School of Celtic Studies in a way. It's a fascinating, the Journal of Anstad is a fascinating insight into some of the tensions in the Irish language movement at the time. Here you have some drawings by Seamus Clondillan, a very famous musician at the time. And he satirizes on Nua Gaelgor, the new Irish speaker. And you see there the new Irish speaker is dressed in a lovely suit and is attending ballroom dances. And this is a reference to a controversy that arose in the Irish language movement when the Lord Mayor wanted to hold a céilí, but a céilí where you did more ballroom dancing and were dressed in your penguin suit and that sort of thing. And it really offended a lot of the figures who would attend on Stad. They liked being countercultural. They really believed in Irish Ireland, and to them this was West Britishism. This was cozying up to the establishment. And indeed, one person writes into the Stad Journal that anyone who attends it will go as a separatist, will go as somebody who wants a complete break from the United Kingdom, and will come back as a home ruler, somebody who wants a more moderate form of nationalism. They talk to sort of other tensions that emerge. There's quite a few references in the Stad Journal to Dublin Irish, as we would call it nowadays. That is Irish that isn't traditional, that doesn't belong to one of the major dialects. For example, at the 1904 Facsimiles, one correspondent complains there's too much English. Another says that only speakers of traditional dialects, or those who are friendly with the judges, win any of the prizes. It's not really about singing, it's about your dialect or how cozy you are with the judges. I'm sure nothing like that happens at a modern equivalent to these competitions today. There are some very striking pictures in the book. This is a reference to the controversy involving the Commissioners of Irish Education, or Commission of National Education, I should say, and the role of Irish in the education system. And here you see the unfortunate bird here. He has a name tag around him that's Trail. He's the provost of TCD at the time. We normally think of the vice provost, Mahaffey, who made some very controversial remarks with regard to the value of studying Irish at this time. He's normally the butt of criticism, but here it's the provost himself, Trail, and he's not being treated with great respect in this particular picture. Here's a very striking one. I don't know if this was based on any contemporary picture in a newspaper or something like that, but it's Arthur Griffith being ejected from the international exhibition. And it's a very well-made picture indeed, as somebody observes at the bottom of the page. The journals are full of references to contemporary political events, a speech by Maud Gonne, even further afield, the war between Russia and Japan gets a mention. There are a couple of really scathing reviews. This is a review of Yeats's 1904 play, The King's Threshold, and it begins, a time the geistach le rot le fada, ach de le head de vluddy rot, near chulamer riv, is vi le quotient eg a National Theatre a nocht. So we've been listening to rot for a long time, but such bloody rot as we heard this evening in the National Theatre, I haven't heard for a long time. And it's a really, really vicious review of that particular play. So this person was not a fan of the Yeatsach, as he calls them, of Yeats. There are quite a few lively debates as well in the book, particularly about the national question, with some members of Unstad being for a more moderate course and some being for a more extreme course, some being home rulers and some wanting complete separation from Britain. And at times quite intemperate debates are carried out on the pages of the book. There's also some very light-hearted pictures. This is charming when one thinks of the Ireland that they were trying to create, that these people were agitating for. Here you have a tram. I think it says Rathmines, and you can see, but it's in Irish on the tram. And at the bottom you have the showman, the West Brit, and it says, by Jove. He's saying, by Jove, having been scandalized at seeing Irish on public transport. And of course, nowadays you walk around Dublin and you're quite used to seeing place names in Irish on the trams or on the bus. But this would have been quite a, almost a utopian idea at the time. So it's fascinating to see it and to see how far their ideas have been realized or not. Best to end with a joke, I suppose. Here we have two people meeting. And on Hiadar, the first man says, Cunas Tatu, how are you? And the Andarafar says, Tome Tubber. And this is a problem that people teaching Irish still have, which is I'm seeing a few laughs in the audience, so some people are getting it anyway. This is when you translate word for word from English into Irish and forget that there are a few different words for well, depending on what you mean in Irish. So Táimé Tubair is supposed to mean I'm well. But of course, it's actually, first of all, grammatical nonsense, but it means I'm a well from which you get water rather than I'm a well, I'm well, I'm feeling well. So anyway, that's my little joke to finish on. If you think it's a terrible joke, I didn't make it, so don't blame me. And with that, I think I'll hand back to Christina.
Well, Tom, it's clear Tubair in it after those fantastic talks. Now, unfortunately, this is my problem now because I'm after running over time. I didn't chair properly, and I apologise. So our time is limited for the Q&A section. But I see we actually only have one question from the audience here from Owen, who asks Anne-Marie a question about the Dunnington manuscripts, and he's wondering if you could tell him maybe a little bit more about their contents.
I actually don't really know much about them because they've only just been very recently digitised. So you'd have to go along. There is a quite extensive bit of analysis from Edgehill Stolkin that's up there as well. If you go through, you should be able to maybe see a little bit more about what both of the manuscripts contained. But I unfortunately haven't done too much research into them as they're just freshly been put up there over the last couple of months. But it's an exciting place to start.
Isn't it wonderful though, the way that catalogue entries have been created for ISOS, descriptions of manuscripts that didn't exist before ISOS existed. So it just shows the, the evolution of manuscript studies, the evolution of digitisation, and that we're just continuing to learn about these manuscripts all the time. And that, Owen, you can access the information about the contents of the Dunnington manuscripts on ISOS. If you go to School of Celtic Studies, you'll see that there's a full catalogue description listing all the items in it. So I think it contains a number of lays and a bit of prose as well. Early modern Irish or modern Irish prose. Do you know, Michal?
No, I don't. I did look at this once upon a time, but when you get to my age, the memory's not what it used to be. Yes, but it's quite late material, but yeah.
I think there's some Fíneacht in there anyway, and you can indeed have a look for yourself. Okie doke. Are there any other questions from the audience? A quiet bunch, that's all right. Well, I would like to say thank you to all of our speakers, and I think they were all fascinating topics, and there's actually a lot in there to consider, and as an audience I'd say it was a lot to take on board. Yeah, thank you Chantal, Anne-Marie, Michal, and to Margaret, who is not present this evening. We're a lot better informed now of the library's contents after this event. I'd also like to thank our director, Rory O'Higgins, for his support. Barry Lewis as well, my communications teammate, and Andy for his IT support and for getting us off the ground. And of course, our school administrator, Eileen Nicunnacha, for her continued support and guidance. We'd be lost without her. And lastly, thank you to the audience for joining us and for your participation, and also for your patience with me earlier on with the technical issue. So your names have all been put into a raffle for a copy of Cloelissa, and which was one of the co-authors was present with us this evening. We were so fortunate, and we will be in touch in due course with the names of the winners of those copies. So we look forward to seeing you again in the future, and hope you enjoyed our Culture Night event. Gurna míle maithagói. Slán agus fanacht.